The entire lecture hall seemed to hold its breath. Professor Eleanor Grayson, with her usual sharp tone, had just made a biting remark. Chuckles rippled through the crowd of students, some nodding in agreement. But at that moment, a voice rang out, cutting through the atmosphere. Calm, steady, yet carrying a weight that made everyone pause. "I think you're wrong." All eyes immediately turned toward the source of the statement. A tall young man, seemingly unremarkable in a simple hoodie, stood up from the third row. No one recognized him. No one knew that he carried a name familiar to all of America. But in that instant, they knew. This would not be an ordinary lecture. They were about to witness a moment that would make everyone reconsider. And the most shocking part? It hadn't even happened yet. A typical Tuesday morning at Whitmore University. The air was crisp, and a thin layer of mist draped over the campus, creating an unusually quiet atmosphere. Students trickled into Lecture Hall 305, their footsteps blending with the murmur of subdued conversations. Professor Eleanor Grayson's Cultural Criticism class was one of the most renowned courses on campus. But it was not for the faint of heart. Grayson was more than just a professor. She was a mind shaper. Her sharp voice, piercing gaze, and ability to turn a simple opinion into a full-blown debate made her both respected and feared. To her students, she was a legend. Once you entered her class, there was no escaping her relentless questioning that cut straight to the core of any argument. Today, her lecture began as usual, a deep dive into how society constructs and idolizes public figures. But among the eager students absorbing every word, there was one who sat in silence, more reserved than the rest. A tall young man in a plain hoodie, hands clasped together, quietly observing. No one paid him any attention. No one knew that this young man had spent his entire life under the glare of the public eye, without ever wanting it. Barron Trump, the youngest son of the former President of the United States, forever tied to the colossal shadow of his family name. But today, in this lecture hall, he was not Donald Trump's son. He was simply a student, a young man yearning for one simple thing, to learn without being judged by the weight of his last name. Barron had chosen Whitmore University, a prestigious yet unpretentious institution, hoping to find freedom in thought. To avoid attention, he had enrolled under a different name. No security detail, no special treatment, just another student among thousands. But today, that anonymity was about to be tested. With just one sentence, everything would change. Professor Eleanor Grayson moved slowly across the lectern, her sharp gaze sweeping over the hundreds of students attentively watching her. She stopped, placed her hands on the desk, and spoke in a low, yet commanding voice. We live in a society that constantly glorifies public figures without truly understanding them. They are praised, elevated to the status of icons. But when we step back and take a closer look, do they truly deserve it? Scattered nods appeared throughout the classroom. Some students scribbled notes, while others were lost in thought. Professor Grayson offered a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it. Let's take a prime example, Melania Trump. Her name echoed through the hall, instantly shifting the atmosphere. A few students straightened in their seats, some exchanged glances. A symbol of silence and beauty. A woman whom the media continuously glorifies, but for what exactly? Because she is beautiful? Because she speaks little? Because she willingly stands in the shadows? She paused for a moment, as if expecting a reaction. From the back of the room, a faint chuckle emerged. A few students subtly nodded, agreeing with the professor's stance. But one person did not laugh. Barron Trump. He remained still, his gaze fixed firmly on the lectern. But beneath the desk, his hands had clenched into fists. For years, he had grown accustomed to hearing people speak about his mother in this way, shallow, dismissive, laced with mockery. But here, in a university lecture hall, among people who were supposed to possess sharp, critical thinking, he was still witnessing the same treatment? Professor Grayson carried on, her tone turning sharper, slicing through the air like a thin blade. Let's examine her Be Best campaign. She raised an eyebrow, a fleeting smirk of derision crossing her lips. A vague initiative against bullying, a hollow slogan, a message so uninspired that even she couldn't make it convincing. And yet, society continues to applaud her? Are we truly celebrating a woman simply because she is beautiful and unchallenging? A small ripple of laughter broke out from the back of the room. A few students nodded, others scoffed, but Barron only felt heat spreading through his body. His mother was not perfect, he knew that. But she was not an empty figure, not a doll who relied solely on her looks to be accepted by society. She did not deserve to be reduced to a joke like this. Barron took a deep breath. Then he raised his hand. The lecture hall fell utterly silent. No one had ever seen the student speak before. No one had ever heard him ask a question in class. But now, all eyes were on him. Professor Grayson lifted an eyebrow, visibly surprised. She tilted her head slightly, her sharp gaze scanning Barron before she slowly nodded. "Yes?" Barron stood up, not hastily, not angrily, but when he spoke, his voice was steady and clear, slicing through the silence like a blade. "Professor, you speak of my mother as if she is nothing more than an image, a product of the media. But have you ever truly understood the person behind the name?" Professor Grayson blinked. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, so brief that it might have gone unnoticed by most. But Barron saw it. He remained standing, unwavering, his icy blue eyes steady and resolute. In this moment, he was no longer just another nameless student among hundreds. He was the son of the woman being ridiculed before him. The room had become so silent that the faint sound of a pen dropping onto a desk was clearly audible. Students who had once lounged casually in their seats now sat upright, fully engaged in the rare confrontation unfolding before them. Grayson crossed her arms over her chest, her gaze growing sharper. "You're saying I don't truly understand your mother?" Barron nodded, unflinching. "That's right, and not just my mother. You're speaking about everyone who is judged superficially, simply because they don't fit the mold that society has created for them." A few students leaned forward, entirely drawn into the debate. Grayson smirked slightly. "I am not mocking her. I am analyzing how the public perceives her." Barron didn't blink. His voice, deep and steady, echoed across the lecture hall. "Then have you ever questioned whether the public's perception is always right? Or is it just a repetition of what they want to believe?" A murmur spread through the class. Some students nodded in quiet agreement. This was not a question that could be answered easily. Grayson tilted her head slightly, studying the young man before her. For the first time, she was no longer looking at Barron Trump as just another student. She was seeing someone who had the ability to challenge her on her own battlefield. But Barron wasn't finished. "My mother grew up in a small town in Slovenia. As a young girl, she dreamed of breaking beyond its borders. She worked relentlessly to build a life of her own. She is not some hollow figure. She is a person." He paused for a beat, his gaze sweeping across the classroom as if engraving his words into the minds of those listening. "We have the right to criticize public figures, but ridiculing someone without understanding their story is not criticism, it's mockery." No one spoke, no one moved. A few students lowered their heads, as if realizing something they hadn't considered before. Others glanced at Grayson, waiting to see how she would respond. Barron lowered his voice, but every word still landed with weight, striking at the very core of those present. "Maybe my mother doesn't fit the image that society expects, but perhaps the real issue isn't with her. It's with how we decide who is worthy of recognition." The atmosphere in the lecture hall grew heavy, as if the entire room had been sucked into an invisible silence. A student slowly set their pen down on the desk, seemingly deep in thought. Another stole a glance at Grayson, anticipating her response. But this time, she did not answer immediately, because some truths, no matter how uncomfortable, simply could not be denied. No one spoke. No one moved. The air in the lecture hall remained thick with silence. But it was no longer the silence of indifference or detachment. It was the silence of minds racing, of people shaken by an idea they had never truly considered before. Professor Grayson stood still, her eyes fixed on Barron in a way that was different from before. No longer was she looking at him as a student she held authority over, but rather as someone whose words had cut through the noise, revealing a depth she hadn't anticipated. She parted her lips as if to say something, then closed them again. Barron remained standing. He did not smile in triumph. He did not wear an expression of defiance. He was simply a young man who had spoken his truth. And in that heavy silence, a single clap rang out. Soft, slow, but unmistakable. A student sitting at the back of the room brought their hands together. Then another. And then another. The applause spread like a wave, rippling from the unseen corners of the lecture hall to the front rows. Within moments, the entire class erupted into a prolonged ovation. Not because they were taking Barron's side, not because they all agreed with him, but because he had made them think. Professor Grayson stood motionless, listening to the applause, her eyes never leaving Barron. Finally, she gave a slow nod. For the first time in the entire lecture, she had no sharp rebuttal. Instead, she simply said, "I will think about that." Barron held her gaze for a brief moment, then quietly sat down. He didn't need to say anything more. He had already said everything that needed to be said. And that was enough. That day, the lesson was not just about cultural criticism. It was about empathy, about seeing the person behind the name, and about the power of a voice when it speaks at the right moment. Not everyone in that room left with a completely changed perspective. But no one left without carrying a question in their mind. A question that perhaps they would be thinking about for a long time. What do you think about this moment? Does true strength lie in grand words, or is it sometimes the quiet conviction that carries the greatest impact? Share your thoughts below. Have you ever witnessed a moment where silence meant more than 1,000 words? If this story made you think, if it resonated with you, hit like and share so more people can reflect on it too. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss more stories that challenge perspectives and spark deeper conversations. Thank you for being here. See you in the next story.